this material is hard to hear. It's hard to talk about. It's going to bring up things. If you have a background in any kind of trauma, physical trauma or sexual trauma, or have helped people with trauma, might have been a family member, this kind of a lesson is triggering. So if that happens, do this with me. Take a low breath in your nose. Blow it out your mouth till it's all gone. Blow it all out. Low breath in your nose and fill your belly. Blow it out your mouth. Now the reality is, if something gets triggering and your heart rate goes up, do the breathing. But if you need more than that, go take more than that. You might need to go leave the room and get a drink of water or go for a walk. Like, you want to take care of yourself in a lesson like this, if it's particularly triggering, okay? So we're going to talk about navigating trauma and sexual abuse. I have an awareness that, honestly, this is one class. We're going to barely touch the tip of the iceberg on this topic, right? But you can contact me at any time. My email is jenniferkonzen@yahoo.com. My name with no dashes, no dots, just my name, jenniferkonzen@yahoo.com, and you can send me any follow-up feelings, thoughts, questions, afterwards, okay? So I do want to give some just general understanding of trauma and some definitions, and then we'll go into sexual trauma specifically. The Greek word for trauma is an emotional wound or shock, often having long-lasting effects. Right? Something happens, and it's not just what happens. That was a trauma. That was a trauma. That was traumatic. That's talking about the event. But trauma actually is more than the event. It's the long-term effects of the event. And as a fellowship and in Christendom, we don't pay attention to the long-term effects. We want to say the event is over and past, but that's not how trauma works. If you're familiar with the book, The Body Keeps the Score, great book, just the title tells you something, right? The body contains those memories and they'll pop out. So we'll talk about that. So what is a trauma response? Well, it's a normal reaction to an abnormal event where someone it overwhelms a person's ability to adapt to life and where they feel powerless. This is a really important wording. So this is when something that happened last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, gets triggered, and their body goes through a trauma response, which can be like they're back on the battlefield if it's military, or they're back remembering when they found evidence of their spouse's betrayal, or they're back in the hospital room remembering when someone they held died. So that, where the body goes back there, the heart rate goes up, the body flushes, the emotions go all over the place. It's really, disassociation happens. People will say they feel like they're not there, or they're in another body, or they've disappeared from the room. All of that is and look at the wording here, a normal reaction to an abnormal event. The event that should never have happened, right? The body is responding normally. It's letting you know something really bad happened back there. And I think that's important because we can either to ourselves say there's something wrong with us that we can't get over that, or you might say it to somebody, or somebody might say it to you. You need to get past that, right? But actually, that's a normal reaction to an abnormal event, okay? And so it is both psychological and physical, that trauma response. What are some of those normal trauma reactions? Sometimes people will have a temporary preoccupation. They cannot stop thinking about it. They ruminate on it. That's especially true of what you call acute stress disorder, where it stays in the mind 24/7. As people get farther away from the event, They might not think about it 24/7, but they still have times of ruminating. There is what you call involuntary intrusive memories. So the thing that happened will pop a picture into the mind at random bizarre moments 30 years later, right? And then there's a replaying of painful memories. Sometimes that replaying actually helps people with their emotional response. Like they're remembering Hurricane Katrina and all that happened and the person that rescued them, and here they are. So the replaying helps them integrate a gradual increase in the tolerance of the dramatic content, which could lead for some to healing by integrating and accepting this did happen. There are a lot of ways to get to that integration. CBT has a trauma-focused CBT. It's probably the most well-known one out, or most used one, most researched one out there. But it's kind of fallen by the wayside some because EMDR is one of the big ones out there right now, eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. There are many different ways to do trauma treatment, but they all have a similar goal: to integrate the trauma into your story, to make it a part of your story where you can tolerate or just live life fully, even though that memory is there, right? However, for some, it can lead to persistent patterns of hyperarousal. So they're in a heightened state of anxiety regularly. Now, for some people, the trauma happened when they were a kid, and then the re-traumatization happens as an adult, or something triggers it. And so their persistent pattern of hyperarousal doesn't actually start until they're an adult. They've shut it down as a kid, they disassociated, then they get married and have children, and they're remembering what happened when they were the age of the child they now have. This happens pretty regularly with individuals I work with. I was 6 when this happened, now my child is 6. And now their body's in hyperarousal state that they didn't even have the room to have back here, right? Or there's avoidance. So one of the women I worked with, she was 15. She was raped by 2 boys still in their baseball outfits after a game. And every time that she couldn't even go to anything that had a baseball emblem on it, she couldn't go to a stadium. She would just, I had another gal though, 14, assaulted on a bus over a period of a whole year over and over by a group of boys. She had shoved it down and didn't remember it. And she was working full time and she always walked home, and she was dating. Why aren't you taking the bus? It's dark, it's not safe. No, I don't take the bus. She didn't even know why she was refusing to take the bus, right? Until actually she started coming to see me. So avoidance. Yes, for some, when it's it hasn't been, we're going to talk about this a bit, validated by other people, like the story that isn't validated by the people who should be loving and taking care of them, or there's a lack of any way of working through the issue, what you call restorative justice. There's no righting that happened. It can lead to corrosive resentment and bitterness. I don't mean that as in like you shouldn't be bitter. Bitterness in itself isn't a problem, but it's bitterness that grows. The seed is one thing, but the growth of it is another, right? When you look at it biblically. And so, you know, what it says in Hebrews is it defiles many, like it defiles the person and defiles those around them. That is really an unworked through trauma often, right? And so having safe people around that can hear the story and contain it, whether it's a therapist or a close friend, is vital to that process, to avoiding that. So what we actually now know, so I've been kind of referring to PTSD so far, but complex PTSD is a new word. It's actually not in our DSM. It is in the ICD-11, which is the International Classification of Diseases. And it's a term that well, I'll just read it. It involves where, same as PTSD, exposure to a severe stressor, but it's repetitive or prolonged. So it keeps happening. It happens over time. It's continuous, not just one event. right? But multiple events. It occurs at developmentally vulnerable times. So we're talking about birth through adolescence, especially, right? Those years where the brain is still developing. It involves harm or abandonment. So that's one of the pieces that we often don't associate with trauma is abandonment, neglect, but actually neglect can be worse than even straight physical and sexual abuse because it's squishier, it's harder to put a name to. It's usually very interpersonal in nature. It's someone that someone trusted. The caregivers are the main culprits, the person who's supposed to keep them safe. Parents, grandparents, parents can be biological parents, step-parents, adopted parents. It is not uncommon where it is a non-family member that is still a caregiver, right? It's less common that it is a biological parent, but it happens with biological parents as well, where the abuse happens. Grandparents, uncles, aunts, so extended family. It's usually the most common perpetrator of sexual abuse is someone they know well. Family friend, immediate family, somebody in the neighborhood, right? That's actually true of all forms of sexual trauma. It doesn't mean that there's not stranger situations. That absolutely happens, rape. But the most common is somebody they know. And yes, we know within our churches, like you've got, I don't even mean our church, I mean worldwide, the churches, if you've followed the last decade of things and starting with the Catholic Church, getting all over the headlines, but it's gone down through the churches and it has impacted our fellowship. It's happened in our fellowship and it's obviously problematic if it's a member, but it's also if it's a leader, right? And it has been leaders where there's been either inappropriate to a minor or inappropriate to someone in the fellowship, right? And of course, one of the things that's challenging is when it occurs in a relationship where that person is supposed to protect, care, and keep someone safe. That doesn't create, it's not just a trauma. Now you've got an injury to the idea of attachment. This person that's supposed to keep me safe. Now it's not just this person, it's people who are supposed to keep you safe are now dangerous often, right? So complex PTSD, by the way, is, so it includes childhood abuse, so a child that is physically abused, sexually abused, abandonment. It also includes long-term marital abuse, sexual abuse in marriage, marital rape, and it also includes serial or even one-time, because again, trauma can be from one-time event or multiple prolonged exposure. So marital infidelity, so the partner that keeps finding pornography, right, over and over and over. So this idea of complex trauma, note the words, multiple, continual, right? That's actually now been applied to all forms of harm that happen over and over, okay? As we're here today, which is why I started off with just breathing and giving you that permission, that talking about sexual trauma can bring up your own triggers. So you might feel okay in this class and tomorrow feel like you can barely keep going. It just brings up whatever, either from current things going on or stuff from your past, right? So make sure you're taking care of yourself after today's class and tomorrow and this week. It just can stir up a lot. Take time, extra time with God. Go walk somewhere beautiful in the rain. You know, do some good self-care. Take that bath, that shower. Like, talk with a close friend. Take care of yourself after a class like this, okay? So I do want to define specifically what sexual abuse is. Sexual abuse can include sexual talk or correspondence, either face-to-face or on some kind of social media. It includes voyeurism, where someone is being watched while they dress or in the bathroom. It includes, by the way, these are the legal definitions in California that pretty much are in every state, okay? It is child prostitution, child pornography, where they're using pictures. It's exhibitionism, where an adult exposes their genitals, doing sexual acts in front. This was actually, I'm kind of laughing at my wording here because this was actually from my slides that I just did in LA to teenagers. And I was trying to say, if this happened to you, where someone did a sexual act in front of you or showed you pornography, right? So just trying to get through that this is, if this happened to you, so you can see my wording there. Molestation, any kind of touching, fondling, or kissing that is unwanted or uncomfortable. It was really important doing this with teenagers to say, here's your definition. When we went through some of the material we're going to go through today. Being forced or coerced to have sex of any kind. Intercourse, so that's penis to vagina. Oral, that is the penis to the mouth. Or forced vaginal oral or anal. Consensual sexual activity, now listen to the wording here, consensual sexual activity between a minor and a significantly older person. And I'm going to show you the chart that shows you the ages legally. Sexual penetration with any object or finger, or a penis, or being forced to penetrate. We tend to think that the only people that, we tend to think of sexual abuse as being male to female, especially if a young male becomes erect. Surely his erection means he wants to be involved. You can actually stimulate the penis to erection and cause a forced penetration. Boys can be raped as well. And I don't mean just raped as in orally or anally. They can be raped by being forced to penetrate. That's important. Our numbers show that the majority of sexual abuse and rape occur with women, but that's actually because our numbers are based on populations like this. They actually don't include incarcerated men. If you include incarcerated men, your numbers almost get even. It's boys and girls. It's not just girls. So that's important. For instance, I had a client who, her memory was they're having a sleepover and they're all in the living room having this great time. They're all asleep. She wakes up in the middle of the night and her, an older male family member, I'm not remembering exactly who, it was like a cousin or a brother, is sitting in one of the chairs looking at all of the sleeping girls and masturbating. That would be sexual abuse, right? So it's just important that we call it what it is legally and in experience, right? And that it's not just penetration. We tend to think of sexual abuse, meaning of a penis to the vagina, but actually it can be touches to the breast, right? So all of that falls under it. There's a different definition for sexual harassment. Sometimes they call it sexual molestation for minors, right? The words are different per state, by the way. Sexual harassment is when there's any sexual pressure put on someone who doesn't feel that they can refuse. Note the wording there. They don't feel like they have the power to say, I'm not interested. This person either has some kind of, they're a boss, they're an older adult, and they don't feel like they can refuse. Or just jokes and unwanted sexual advances. The whole idea of a friendly pat and accidental touches. When I first started practicing as a therapist, I got this call, hey, we'd like to interview you, you're a sex therapist. Our mayor is, being accused of, and we'd like to see how people think about this. And I was like, I felt a bit unprepared. I did the interview, but it hit me. I was living through, our mayor was tossed out of office because of the friendly pat and the accidental touches. This was before Me Too began, right? And then it was literally just in a couple of years. And I'm a marriage and family therapist. I mostly see couples, probably 50% of my clients are couples. And Me Too walked in the door into my office. Female after female just doing this because they'd not ever talked about the accidental touches and the friendly pats that happened to them their whole lives. And then their husbands are like, but that's not me, but that's not me. So it came in my office quite a bit, right? And the women in this room could tell their stories about just how many ways sexual harassment happens. So, and definitely the power difference, the sexual pressure put on someone who doesn't feel they can refuse. The piece about power differential isn't just about age. It can be about position authority, things like that. Also, sometimes you'll work, I worked with a woman, she is your sister, and she was molested by her father for years, from like 4 to 12. I saw her as a 40-something-year-old married woman with kids, right? And she still was saying to herself at that age, in her 40s, educated, great job. She was still saying to herself, but I enjoyed it, so it must have also been me. A 4-year-old and a 12-year-old goes, that felt really good, because it does feel good, right? So they remember that feeling good. They have no power or ability to say, hey, wait, you shouldn't be doing that to me. So this is why age is really important. That age difference and that power differential is really important. So other types of sexual violations would include exploitation. That is where it's conduct involving matter depicting a minor engaged in obscene acts. So this is child pornography, right? Knowingly involving a child in prostitution or a live performance with obscene sexual conduct, or to pose or model for purposes of a film, photograph, and so on. Or if a person develops, duplicates, prints, or exchanges that information. So you see a lot of people, in the news or in jail for that last bullet right there, right? I worked with a couple, they came to me for sex therapy. They were coming for couples work, about a month into therapy. Yeah, so she came in she could barely talk in a session. Her 80-year-old father had just been arrested for child pornography. And I won't even go into the details of what they discovered over the next couple months that he'd been doing for decades. And it was her father. And the husband in the middle of all of this, just to tell you the truth, was like, when are we going to get back to sex therapy? And I'm like, bud, you got years before we can work on things between you, because the trauma of this. So when we say the trauma of sexual violations, it's not just to the individuals, because all of those individuals that man harmed, and the family that it harmed, and the generational trauma, and the grandkids that was affecting, who now know about what grandpa was doing all those years. This is true of happening in families, and it's true happening in spiritual families. The trauma goes poof, poof, poof. We had articles earlier this year? Oh my goodness, that was this year. Lawsuits, right, beginning this year. So I've had the opportunity to work with some of the churches around the therapy. We do get focused on law. Let's make sure that we're checking our children's ministry workers, and that we're doing things legally, and that we're reporting when we need to report. And we should focus on law, but the problem is we don't always focus on therapeutic, like what's just happened to the spiritual family. This is affecting everybody, and everybody that's ever been abused is now been triggered by what just got revealed. And we don't know how to talk about it. Now, I'm not saying this is like any one congregation. I actually had someone come up to me, and so I'm at a conference, and somebody who I love and respect, and who loves and respects the work I do, said, Jennifer, have you been getting a ton of calls? This is when everything came out in January, right? About the lawsuits. And I said, no, but I should be. And I don't even mean that like in a bad you, but we go legal. And I'm like, now the church most affected, LA, honestly, was the church that had me come up and say, can you help us, right? And they didn't have me do law, they had me do therapeutic. How has this impacted the body? So we just have to, whether it's in a physical family or a spiritual family, it ricochets when those violations happen. And figuring out how to talk about it, especially when it has legal repercussions, is actually kind of tricky to do. Other sexual violations is sexual assault, and rape and interpersonal violence. We're not going to talk about those. Marital rape, date rape, IPV. We're going to mostly talk about child sexual trauma today, but those are also included in the idea. Who are the perpetrators? Who is harmed? The number one is children and minors. There are children that are 1 and 3 that have been sexually assaulted through penetration. So it happens to babies, to tell you the truth. The most common is minors. The next most common is women. So this is women past the minor years, then men, but seniors are being violated in their care facilities. The disabled actually are really high on the list. Again, power differentials. Somebody of power harming somebody that can't, doesn't have the ability, doesn't know how to say, I don't want that, right? So who are the perpetrators? I already mentioned some of that. The most common is a family member. The second is family friend or a member of the community. Caretaker, leader, teacher, schools, religious leaders, and coaches. We know about the big ones, right? The gymnastics coach who, right? Simone manages to say it in public and say, this is what happened, right? So it's happening, it happens, it's still happening. Yes, strangers are perpetrators, military personnel, it happens in groups. So perpetrators, again, but the most is the people someone already knows. So this is also happening, that the trauma happens and then they get CPS workers involved and cops involved and the courts involved and the people asking questions involved. And often the minor or child is now re-experiencing the trauma. So I've had multiple families in my office where, so I had a family where it was dad, daughter had an infection and she had cream that she was supposed to take that the doctor gave for the vaginal infection, and dad put the cream on and violated multiple times. Dad is now in jail. Her trauma, the teenager, so by the time she came and saw me, this had happened when she was 12. She came and mom and her saw me at 15. She said, this was, she's still gonna be working through that trauma for the rest of her life. The teenager though was telling me what it was like in court and how people didn't believe her and they questioned her like she was lying. Somebody just asked me this the other day. They said, but I know because this happened, that so-and-so, I know this personal story of this individual who said they were assaulted and then they came back later and said they lied. And I said, right. We hear those stories and we think, see, that means that there are liars. That is such a rarity. Like, it's so rare. And yet we go cling to that, right? The damage that does to the person who's finally had the boldness to let those words pass their lips, and then they're questioned and not believed, like the re-experiencing of the trauma is often worse than the trauma itself. I get asked this a lot. Elders throughout our body, evangelists will call me and say, so this is what's happening, how should we handle it? But what if this person is, or it's two people who are in their 20s and he has one story and she has another, right? So this comes up. The reality is anybody who's willing to speak up is going to be about 99% truthful. So that's what we should pay attention to, let God sort out the rest. So that is just in case you're wondering, that's my input to every elder that calls me, is you assume correctness until you find something different, because the damage of the re-experiencing of unbelieving is stronger. Okay. This is the chart used in San Diego. It's pretty much close to most in California in states. So what you're seeing here, the word CJ is clinical. This is about mandated reporters, by the way. Somebody like me or any of the ministers in this room are mandated reporters. Well, ministers are mandated reporters. In most states, it's still this way. If they find out in any manner that wasn't a confession. If it's found out in confession, they're not mandated reporters. They can report, but they're not mandated to report. Therapists don't have, they're mandated reporters, period, so are doctors and nurses and teachers. So clinical judgment means you still can report. M means mandated. So notice the dates here, the ages. So it's 12 here on the left. If it's a 12 and a 14-year-old, that's a mandated report. We think, oh, well, they're two minors. That's a mandated report. Okay, so it's just important that you know that. But if they're 13 and 13, it's clinical judgment. So the cutoff in California, you need to know that for Ohio, I actually don't know what it is 14, right? Now notice the 13-year-old, 13 all the way up, doesn't matter, right? Doesn't matter if the person is 14 or 15 or 16 or 17. 14, you'll notice, if they're 14 and they're doing it with a 12-year-old, it's mandated, right? Because you can reverse those numbers. But notice, a 14 to 14. So California considers 2 minors of over 14 years old as clinical judgment, meaning if you've got a power differential, this is a girl, let's just say it's a girl, and she's got an educational deficit. She's lower in her IQ, and he might be the same age, but he's got a power differential and he takes advantage of her. That would actually be a mandated report because there's the power difference, right? However, you'll notice here the 14-year-old with the 21-year-old. So there's that age gap is a mandated report. So see that? 14-year-old with a 21-year-old and on. Any child 14 and older is a mandated report in California, okay? So does that make sense about how that works? Now this is, again, this is law. That's not therapeutic because that 14-year-old and that 14-year-old, it might have been forced, right? So, or that 14-year-old and that 18-year-old might have been forced. So that's why it's clinical judgment. It's not mandated, but if there's a power differential, okay? So, all right, what are some ways that you can tell if there's been physical abuse? I get asked this a lot. This is actually a picture drawn by a sexually abused child. Okay. There are physical indicators. So with rape, and so I worked with a family where they had an adopted daughter. Dad molested her from 4 to 7. And they were able to verify it physically. So physical signs to her body. Behavioral, this is what you'll see a lot. So the mom had noticed really suggestive behaviors. You know, her daughter's doing all these kinds of things at 6 years old, and she's thinking, is this because of trauma that happened when she was a baby that we don't know about? Like, where are these really sexually suggestive moves coming from? They were coming from the molestation that was happening. So behavioral things like that, they are not an absolute. There are plenty of little girls that put on a little tank top and look in a mirror and go, you know. So it's not an absolute, but it's something to pay attention to. You'll see a lot of emotional side effects, mood swings. So I worked with the entire family of the dad. He's now in jail. Who had the 4 to 7-year-old that came out when she was 9. And she was a pretty normal, except for those like behaviors that were like, right? When it all came out, nobody knew it all came out because she said something to somebody. She said something to mom, and mom found out the details. That child has been a mess. She's been a mess. You know, she's been all over the place. She's been suicidal. She's been cutting. She's in a better spot. They've moved out of the house because she just couldn't do the house anymore. They've all gotten help. They had mandated therapy. Mom got accused of being an unprotective parent. They're doing well. Mom's doing well. The kids are doing pretty well. The boys have been, the 2 boys, they're older, they've been struggling pretty big time, right? The emotional effects are family-wide. This girl, she's going to be dealing with the rest of her life. She was 4 to 7. She's going to be dealing with it the rest of her life. Relationally, it really impacts the ability to build good intimacy. It affects relationships. That doesn't mean that people can't have great relationships. Some of you might have a sexual abuse background and you've figured out how to build good relationships. It just makes it harder. It makes more things that have to be relearned. There's so many more triggers that happen. For some people that have sexual abuse, the trigger happens, like the sexual trigger happens immediately, meaning like the first time they're touched by someone that they're in a romantic relationship with, they're triggered. Some happens, I get asked this, it happens on the honeymoon. Let's say there are two people that haven't had sex and they get married, and it happens on the honeymoon. The majority of people, in my experience, it's about 5 to 7 years into marriage, where it's either having children or the stresses of marriage or the stresses of life, and all that trauma that got shoved down or was just kind of passed over during the early marital fun and relationships and sexuality, that just kind of bubbles up by about 5 to 7 years in my experience. So we do know that all of these, one of the effects are mental health. If you've heard of the ACEs study, Adult Childhood Experiences Study, it's out of San Diego. They followed people's medical records for lifelong, and 20 years to 40 years or something like that. And the higher the ACEs score, the number of times that they were harmed in some way, had a significant connection to mental health scores and medical, meaning illnesses, cancers, things that you go, what would that have to do with childhood sexual abuse? My client, she's in her 50s. She was abused by a doctor as a minor, using needles to the vagina. And she was in my office, and she was talking about she was getting a new doctor. And right when she said the word to me and she pictured the white lab coat, her vagina started hurting. There is a direct correlation between the pain of the thought and the body response. So that's why it affects physical health and mental health. And we had to do all kinds of exercises, as you can imagine, right there in the therapy office, right? She was triggered just live saying the word. And then definitely what you'll see with children is high risk taking, sexual risk taking. So especially if they're minors, they'll end up becoming very risky sexually, multiple sexual partners, doing things that are dangerous, expose them to STDs and pregnancy. They're acting out their trauma. And then they become Christians. This is what's significant for all of you, that woman, that man becomes a Christian, and we call it sexual sin, that they were all involved in this, they were like really promiscuous. Okay, it's not God's plan. They did things that God did not intend sexually, but we need to look at why did all of that happen? I have a woman I was just recently working with, and she said, I'm grateful I became a Christian. I'm grateful for all the people that helped me become a Christian. She said, but one of the damages I've realized is it was all, do you see your sin? And nobody recognized that all that crazy sexual acting out was because of my sexual abuse. So it's just important that we approach this with a whole different lens of why that's there, right? So non-normative behaviors, or the opposite. You'll get people that then avoid sex for their entire life, including in their marital relationships, because it's just too triggering. Or the specific acts that were done to them come up in the marital or any partnered sexual relationship. That comes into my office a lot, where this is physically what happened to me. I was forced to do this with a hand on my head. So anytime my husband puts his hand on my head, my whole body seizes, right? So the long-term effects in even loving relationships can cause avoidance. And actually, we do know for both men and women, it causes sexual functioning challenges in marriage. So the long-term effects are very real. The ACEs research, shame is long-term. One woman, she was 14 and at a party, she'd been doing drugs and drinking. A guy says, I'll give you a ride home, and rapes her. She's your sister, she's in her late 50s, and she's telling me, I did that. It was I was doing drugs. I was a pervert. She had all these really negative words about herself. And I said, so let's walk through that, I'm the one that was the cause, which is a common one, right? For children and women and even older women. And I said, so were you doing drugs? Yeah. Should you have done it? No. Okay. Were you drinking? Yeah. Should you have done it? No. Were you at a party that was all kinds of sexual things going on, drugs and sex, and was that a good place to be? Should you have been there? No. Right now. You can take responsibility for all of that. you made a decision to go with somebody that you didn't know. Was that safe? Was that a good idea? No. Okay. Take responsibility for that. He raped you. You have no responsibility for that. Zero. She had not had anybody walk her through that. That's where therapy can sometimes be helpful. But the reality is that's what people do, is they associate, but I did. And then they hear it. Well, what were you wearing from grandma and aunt so-and-so? What were you doing? Were you suggestive? It doesn't matter how suggestive a teenager is. Nobody in a position of power should take advantage of that. What should come out of their mouth is, hon, why are you doing that? That's what should come out from, somebody of a mature age. So shame about the gal who I told you was raped by the baseball players. She said to me, it's just hard sometimes to hear some of the ways people shame themselves. She said, I have to tell you something I've never told anybody. I've always wondered, I have a gap between them touching me as I'm standing and then being on the bed. I don't remember what happened. And she goes, and I always think, did I walk to the bed? Right? Did I go there of my own accord? This happens lifelong, right? And we can be the ones that go, let's talk about that. That's a common piece where that shame stays there, the wondering, did I do something? I had another woman who was in a research study that I did on shame, married Christian women's experiences of shame and sexuality. And she identified shame as I'm the one at fault when something happens. And then she was doing it in her marriage, even in her marriage, but she was also doing it lifelong. So she was in the military and she was in a class. She goes to take a drink from a water fountain. And she says, I bent over and then I feel somebody go bump up against my buttocks. And I'm thinking it's one of the fellow students. And I turn around to hit them and it's my instructor. And she said the sentence that went through her mind was, what did I do to give him the idea that that was okay? Mm-hmm. So that idea of I'm to blame happens for men. I have a lot of men I work with who've been assaulted and they say the same sentences, and women. I know I'm using a lot of women examples, but these are the conversations I have with both. The shame is long-term. Disassociation is common, including during sex as an adult. And so it impacts adult intimate relationships. Okay, so these are some strategies that perpetrators use. This is straight out of the teaching on, and I need to check my time. How are we doing? We're doing great. We're doing good? But you don't know how many more slides I have, Michelle. Somebody who is preparing to harm someone in this way sexually, they'll start to pay special attention, to do special little things, buy little gifts. They offer advice and they're really supportive. So this is the coach driving his, team member home and giving advice and support. Might be a totally giving, supportive person, but this is where it can start, where grooming starts. The word is grooming, by the way, getting someone in the spot of being taken advantage of. They might buy things and then get you alone and then try to touch. And then they'll say, you did something that was wrong. That's a common approach, that you're the one that enticed me. The father of the 4 to 7-year-old, he said, well, she was always so seductive. He said that. She would lure me. He said that. So, it becomes a thing. They'll use online harassment, using suggestions in sexual language. They'll say things so they'll send emails and texts. They'll say, let's play a game. That's a common one. And then they'll almost always say, ask you not to tell. It was really important saying all of this to the teens in LA, just so you know, this is what it looks like, so that you can recognize it. It was kind of hard because some of them had already experienced it, those in that room. It's really hard for them to tell somebody. There's so much nervousness, they're scared, they feel guilty, and then they feel intimidated to tell somebody in authority, like a law, they've been reading on the internet that they're gonna have to go tell a policeman, so then they don't tell because they don't want to do that. They are fearful of telling a doctor or a family member or a minister because they already are old enough to know the repercussions. This is specific to minors, adolescents. And so it's really important to understand just how hard it is for those words to get past the lips about what happened. So this is important. I'm going to briefly go over it. The idea of what is consent. My kids came home from high school and they had just had a debate on if the girl did this and the guy did this, did he take advantage of her? Was that wrong? So that's kind of what this is geared towards. What is consent? So the definition of consent, so this is I am consenting to be sexual with you, is an agreement between two people to engage in sex. So the question is, if someone doesn't say no, so let me just ask you guys this. If someone does not say no, the word no does not pass their lips, is that consent? It is not consent. The word yes has to come out of the mouth in some fashion. If someone said no at first, but then didn't continue saying no, is that consent? This comes into my office a lot. I was having fun making out, but I didn't want that, right? If someone was okay with kissing, but then did not feel okay with being touched more, is that consent? No. If someone did not ask to remove clothing, and their clothing or the other person's clothing is removed, is that consent? If you already had sex with someone, does that mean you're giving consent for another time? If you said yes at first, but now feel like no, is that consent? So let me ask about that second to last bullet. Let's all look at that. If you already had sex with someone, does that mean you've given consent for another time? Is that consent? Never, right? And we will go there, but this was a dating couple. This was somebody who had already had sex, so it must have meant, right? And we do that actually in marriages too. I worked with a couple where, in this case, she had said no, that anal sex was painful. They were on a getaway. He turns her over, enters her anally, and they're in my office. And I'm kind of, so I looked him straight in the eye and I defined marital rape. And I said, it's important that you understand that what just happened between you guys on your vacation getaway falls into that definition. You guys have to decide what to do with that, but that's the definition. It's just important that people know what consent is, what rape is, what molestation is, and that we call it the name that it is. Another, did they ask, is this okay? Did the person ask, is this okay? Because that has to happen. So there's a book by Cliff and Joyce Penner. They have a chapter on by invitation only. It's actually for married couples. Super great chapter. Did you say the word yes? So this again is for the teenager going, did that guy, did that woman, did she say, is this okay? Did I say yes? Did you say no? And then they kept going. So I was working with a couple teens. The boy kept touching. The girl said no. But then she stopped saying no, so he kept touching, right? We've got to talk about that. The one no is where it should have stopped, right? Did someone question the kind of clothes you were wearing and say that meant yes? Well, what you were wearing, right? How old were you and how old were they? And did you feel pressured? So this is what you can actually give. You can use these slides with your teen ministry and go over consent. I would actually recommend that. So understanding power and control. Not everyone can give sexual consent. Even if they want to, there must be equal levels of power and control between everyone involved. It can be hard to say no to sex if there's an unequal power balance. No one person should be making all the decisions or forcing another person to engage in sexual acts. Things that can influence a person's power in relation to someone else include age, relationship to the person, ability to fully understand, and their control in your life. If they have any level of control in your life, the likelihood that consent is there is low. I'm not going to go over these because we've basically done it just now through those questions, but they are on the slides on consent defined, all right, legally. And look at this. And actually all of these would include in marriage, right? With enthusiasm, it says, that'd be a great marriage class. All right, examples of sexual coercion include when a person persistently attempts to have sexual contact with someone after refusal. So, same kind of thing. And so, there is a national assault line. I think everybody should have this on their phone, just in case you work with anybody that has shared something with you. Give this phone number to them. There is an online program, online.rassault.org, RAINN, I forget what that stands for, .org, and that's also in Spanish. That's important, right? There's a Spanish version. One of the things that once you have given someone that information, you got to understand that there are lots of repercussions if they tell. They might not be aware of, but boy, the mandated reporting piece creates chaos in their lives. CPS coming in can be really scary and painful. Going to a medical doctor and getting checked, doing a rape test. Some of you have been involved with that. It is traumatizing. It's an important part, but it's an awful experience for most. They have these questions. How much do I need to tell? What happens after I tell? Will I be taken away from my family? So this is a minor, right? Could someone go to jail and they're worried about uncle going to jail, so they don't tell, right? What if I was drinking and doing drugs when it happened? Do I have to have a medical exam? Which, by the way, they can refuse a medical exam. That's really important. They can refuse a medical exam. I tell those who come to see me, they've not told anybody yet, right? I'm the first person they're telling. They get to decide when they're ready to tell an authority where legal stuff gets involved. Their life is going to explode the moment they share. So it's just, they need to do it with knowledge and understanding and support, right? And then the question, can I bring someone into the exam with me? And the answer to that is yes. So just, if you're ever helping someone, that's going to be true nationwide, okay? So when you're talking to young children, these 3 words are important. Say it, tell it, report it. So they say it out loud, they tell a person in authority, it gets reported. Like that would be the process. We say, we tell, it needs to be reported, right? So just a simple acronym or set of words to just remember. I do want to say that one of the things that I mentioned earlier is the impact on family systems. And what I mean by that is the family system physically, but the family system spiritually. Literally, physical things will come up. Like, let's take it just as a church family. I can promise you, when things happen in a church, I know this for sure in San Diego, when things came out on some events, literally, we had individuals coming to me and others, all of their physical symptoms about their previous experiences happened. So the body responds, the heart rates are up, people are having problems sleeping, they're waking up in the middle of the night. I had a young man say to me that he'd heard about all of these assaults that happened, and he would have nightmares about assaulting his wife, right? He loved his wife, but the trauma of what he had just heard kept coming up in his dreams, and he didn't want to tell her. He was sobbing. I don't want to tell her, I don't want to tell her, right? That this just keeps going through my mind. So it affects people, their dreams, their waking state, their bodies, their heart rates are up. And this is entire families. It affects things spiritually. Sometimes the spiritual crisis will come up. Where was God? Where was God in this? And then we say, we say platitudes, sometimes tactlessly, when we're trying to reassure somebody. The reality is when somebody's saying, where is God? How I answer is, right? You're wondering, where was he? Sit with them in their spiritual crisis, because it's a really good question. Guess who asked it? David. Where are you, God? Why is this happening? And guess who else asked it? Jesus on the cross. So when someone has spiritual doubts, we need to listen, because it is a common response to this, and it can be a long-term response. I have a friend who, not a rape or anything, but traumatic death occurred of a spouse, and she's 10 years out, and we've been friends through all of it. And she said to me for the first time, I'm willing to talk about, because I've said to her, whenever you're ready, I'm not going to ask you again, but whenever you're ready, I'm willing to look at who God is and his love for you. That was years ago that I told her that. We had lunch a couple months ago, and she said, yeah. So her therapist is a lesbian female, just to give you perspective, who doesn't believe in God, And her therapist said, you need to go back to church. And she said, okay. So we're having lunch and she says to me, okay. And we sat down last week for the first time, and it's been 10 years. I think God is really patient with how long our trauma takes to get worked through, and we need to be that patient with others. I haven't always been. I'm giving you a great story of me being patient for 10 years. That has not always been my response through the years. I've learned it over time. The other big things that happens in families is family secrets. We shouldn't tell. We don't, it's super wise to think about just how much details to tell, but talking openly, and this is physical families. It's because people will ask me, should we tell? Should we inform? It's age appropriate sharing. Like, you're not always going to tell a 4-year-old what you're going to tell a 14-year-old and what you're going to tell a 24-year-old. But let me tell you, being a family therapist, family secrets kill. It's so damaging. The thing is, it happens in spiritual families, like big time. Now, I don't know what level we should say things at, but family secrets in spiritual families kills, right? So the lack of openness can be really damaging. That's actually, by the way, all of this is from research on physical families, but it very much applies, in physical families. Okay, I'm going to go to the very end of this. There's some other stuff that will just come with the slides if you get them. There are forms of treatment. Okay, so this sounds like, oh my gosh, nobody's ever going to get better. Actually, if a caregiver, an adult, a ministry leader, grandpa, uncle has a validating response. People ask me, I had a family call me, 12-year-old cousin assaulted 7-year-old cousin. Parents call me, and one of their questions was, how much is this going to traumatize our son through the years? And I said, your son is going to be talking about this when they're 70. But your supportive response will have a huge impact on just how much of a trauma response happens for them. So, good treatment, healthy responses, openness. Openness is key. So here's some of the treatments. I just threw them on here so that you would know. EMDR, trauma-focused CBT I mentioned earlier, prolonged exposure therapy, hypnotherapy, neurofeedback, yoga. Go read the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Bessel van der Kolk is the guru on trauma, and he's been the researcher on every single one of these. Medications, couples therapy. I do touch exercises with couples, so I work with trauma a lot. And the impact on spouses. So I'm working with the couple, and this one was traumatized as a kid, and it's coming up in their marriage. That comes up in a lot. Or the trauma happened in the marriage. And then there's an absolute spiritual process of treatment. Reclaiming God's view of sexuality is a part of it because it got damaged, right? And the spiritual healing of who is God and where is he? Where was he? Why didn't he stop it from happening, right? That's a really important process. For children, so I just had somebody reach out to me, do you work with 7-year-olds? My clients are all online. I'm like, I have a long background in play therapy with children and adolescents, but I now am completely online, so I don't see children because play therapy, doesn't work well online. So I referred to a play therapist. That is the most common thing for children, and it's really doing play therapy was very enjoyable for me, and very meaningful for the kids. Yeah, I could tell stories. Group therapy, individual therapy for kids, play therapy, art therapy is huge. Learning how to identify feelings is huge. So, all right, then for you, take a big breath in your nose, out your mouth. Blow it all out till there's nothing left. Blow it all out. Take a big breath in your nose. Fill your belly. And blowing it out. You want to always check how your heart rate's doing when we're having these kind of conversations. And then make sure that you do some really good self-care and you're compassionate to yourself, right? It would be normal that this would be a harder time. I do want to leave you with this. In all their distress, he too is distressed. He's watched what's hard for you, even in listening to today's class. And God goes, oh. We know this about Jesus. He's watching a woman at the funeral for her son, a widow. And it says his heart went out to her. The word there is splachnizomai, which means his guts were moved. His entire body went, oh, right? That's how God responds to the distress you feel either tonight or in any of the kind of things we're talking about tonight. This is the heart of God. He took note of their distress when he heard their cry. This is the heart of our Father. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion. Some of you have heard me say this week. This is one of my favorite verses. And the God of all comfort. These are stated as titles. Titles of God. The Father of all compassion and the God of all comfort. And it helps when we can remember that, right? If you have your own background and you're working through things, this is a book I always recommend, The Sexual Healing Journey by Wendy Maltz.